Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to this splendid spring evening. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Nijmegen Centrum voor Ethiek, Center of Ethics, and the Soeterbeeck Programme. As you've seen on the poster, we have a rather important issue before us tonight. The issue is how far will we, can we, or should we modify human beings? What are the limits that we will reach, won't reach, shouldn't reach, and so forth? So the whole question of developments that will take place, should not take place, might want to take place. So the whole range of it. The question about the kind of an improved humanity has been with us at least since the 19th century, and more precisely from the moment in which Francis Galton, nephew of Charles Darwin, invented the word eugenics. And what he meant by eugenics was really to take, as he coined it, evolution into our own hands. So rather than let the evolution of the human species over to to chance and accident and natural selection, that it should be up to us to sort of plan where we should be going. And then, of course, the question comes up very quickly, according to which standards should we do that? Now, we've come a very long way since the days of Francis Galton, because the possibilities that genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, robotics, nanotechnology, and biomedical interventions have all opened up over the last decades, put these questions with a much greater urgency. They do call for a whole range of reflections, some of them simply having to do with predictions and kind of futurology, and others with policy-making ethics, and also with something we might call philosophical anthropology, namely, what kind of being are we now, what are our shortcomings, which parts should we amend or not, at which point are we going to lose ourselves. Now, tonight's speaker has chosen this range of topics as his professional domain of study. So in a moment, you will meet Dr. Anders Sandberg, or if I say the name correctly in Swedish, Anders Sandberg. I don't know whether it was correct. Now, Dr. Sandberg, I'll keep the English version of it, has a PhD in computational neuroscience from Stockholm University, but is currently a James Martin research fellow at the institute, at an institute of Oxford University, which has an extraordinary name, namely it's called nothing less than the Future of Humanity Institute. Now, when one thinks about the future of humanity, one cannot possibly do empirical research or only empirical research. I mean, the future is quite kind of difficult to capture empirically. This is why our speaker tonight is not only described on various websites, including his own, as an academic researcher, but also as a science debater. So that's one of the things we are going to do today. Futurist, transhumanist, or simply, for want of a better word, as an author. I expect that his lecture tonight will combine all of these professional descriptions. Now, the structure of this evening is going to be as follows. Dr. Sandberg has about 55 minutes, a short hour, as we would say in Dutch, to hold forth. Then he is going to be rebutted, confuted, and annihilated by Dr. Landeweert, whom I will introduce to you in due time. After that, we will have first question and answer session, or a discussion between the three of us, which we will then open up to all of you. And all of these pleasant activities should take about 2 hours. We hope to have to close here at around 9:30, with or without having reached a consensus. Now, I give the word to Dr. Sandberg. Please welcome him to this floor.
Thank you very much for inviting me over here and giving me a chance to come to your fair town. I like getting to Dutch towns that challenge me to try to pronounce the name Nijmegen, or how it's done locally. And by the way, you got my name at least right. So, why am I really here? Well, there was this mention of this institute, and some of you might wonder, wait a minute, isn't that in the philosophy department? What does a computational neuroscientist do in the philosophy department? And the real reason is, of course, I'm one of those annoying students who can't keep to a single topic. So I'm rather broad. I'm interested in everything, and this is not always a good thing because it means that I'm getting easily distracted. It also is a good thing, however, because it allows me to look at very different disciplines. I'm going to try to draw stuff both from philosophy and neuroscience and some other areas, and try to show a picture of where have we been going as a species, and what are the technologies we might now be getting that can change us. And then have a little discussion about, well, how would we go about deciding in what direction to change, and what do different people think about it. We'll see how it turns out. Of course, improvisation is fun, and especially since I had a lapse of the time management, there might be some slides in the totally wrong order or even with too much text. That's probably the authorship thing. So, my institute, it's part of a good old Oxford University, but we're working very much aimed at the future. We're trying to understand really long-term questions, very big picture. I literally have a paper in the works right now about consideration about environmental policy for the next 1 trillion years. After all, stars, we're running out of them. Not for the next few 100 billion years, but eventually. What do we do about it? And some of you might say, wait a minute, that doesn't matter here and now. But it turns out that many questions about the really deep future might actually affect what value exists in our present. So when we look at these big picture questions, we're interested in what might change the human condition, considerations that might actually force us to change direction where we're going. One such area is existential risk, threats to the survival of a species. I'm not going to be talking much about it here, but it's rather core for our research, because whatever we do, whatever we think is worthwhile to do with our own life or as a species, if we get wiped out before we can achieve it, we probably missed all the value. And that would presumably be extremely bad. So we need to reduce those risks. Then there are emerging technologies that might change everything in a lot of wonderful ways, except that the technologies that might change things in the most positive ways might also be potentially the most dangerous ones. So again, they might add to the risk. And finally, there is this really interesting question, how to say something sensible about the future rather than just doing hand waving or drawing a lot of graphs showing trend lines, or even bringing up a crystal ball and trying to do some predictions with it. Because if there is one thing we know from the history of prediction, is that we're rather bad at doing predictions. Which is interesting, because every day we as individuals actually do a lot of very accurate predictions about the future. It's just that it's our own near-term future. I can confidently predict that if I lift this glass and drop it on the floor, it will shatter and it will make a mess. So I will not do that. That prediction is a very simple one. It's based on past experience. I can make a more complicated prediction that if I leave tomorrow morning for the right train and go to a certain airport and show certain documents to certain people, I will be on a flight away to Oxford. That's a rather complicated thing. We would be really amazed if we could program our computers to figure out things like that effectively. And similarly, we do predictions about our relationships and how our own lives work. And most of these ones are rough. They're not based on a lot of the information, but they're reliable enough to make us live lives that work generally fairly well. However, we might be better able to do predictions under some circumstances than others. Now, how come we're good at our personal predictions, but rather bad at the big picture predictions? Again, I don't have the time to get into this, but this is something we're really intrigued by. How can we simulate the future in an accurate way? Or understand how inaccurate it is so we can make something sensible out of it? It's a bit like weather forecasting. We know that the weather forecast for tomorrow is going to be pretty accurate, and we know roughly how useless the weather forecast for next week is. However, we can make a good forecast that it's going to get warmer every month until June or July, because we have other kinds of data. We can use other kinds of reasoning. We can use climate simulations to make predictions that suggest that, yeah, it's going to get a lot warmer over the next century, and so on. We have various tools, and some of them are accurate, some of them are having various flaws. And in some domains, we understand how to use them well. In others, we're just fumbling around in the dark. Our institute is mostly about the fumbling around in the dark part. And typically, when philosophers figure out how to do something well, it becomes its own subject. Then it becomes natural science, or it becomes psychology, or history, or economics, and they get their own department buildings and a much bigger budget. Yes, the stuff that remains, the messy stuff, that's philosophy. But philosophers, on the other hand, get to play around with interesting concepts. So, where have we been and where are we going? So, if you're not a neuroscientist or a zoologist, you're probably going to say those brains look roughly the same. If you did not have the labels on top, you would probably be hard-pressed to tell which one is human and which one is a chimpanzee. Both are complicated, folded objects. If I showed you microphotos, not even professional neuroscientists would be able to tell you the difference. It's essentially the same system. Yet there are some small differences, and those small differences actually lead to very dramatic changes. So if we go back 5 million years to our last common ancestor, who was a somewhat chimp-like ape, he or she was living in an African environment, perhaps using very simple stone tools, picking up but not really building tools or anything. Gradually, two populations for some reason became separated. And 5 million years down the line, things are rather weird. Because one branch is still in the forests of Africa, as well as various zoos and labs around the world, but mostly in the forests of Africa. And the chimps are still living like they used to do 4 million years ago, most likely. So they can use stones to break up nuts, but they don't transport them. They have social hierarchies. They're fighting tribal battles, which can be pretty nasty. The more nicer bonobo cousins are solving everything with sex instead. But generally, they haven't changed much. And however, the chimps, if we could wonder, we would have noticed that the forests have become much smaller. There are roads through them. There are weird metal birds flying in the air. And those cousins who moved over to the savannah seems to be everywhere. We humans are the most common large animal in our weight class. We're found in every ecosystem on Earth, even the Arctic. That's rather weird. Most species keep to the ecosystem where they evolved. Maybe they adapt a little bit, but typically they evolve into other species as we move around. Nope. It's the same species all over the place. You find that humans in all environments. And the main reason why we're so successful is, of course, that first we make tools and then we can instruct each other in the use of tools. It's not just that we make something and then it's over. No, we actually teach it to each other. And we're very effective in coordinating because we've got a language. And that allows us to accumulate knowledge. We have a cumulative culture. Whales, for example, repeat good whale songs. There are some hits moving around the Pacific right now. But the best whale songs have not been repeated for very long. It's not like there are some perennial hits that always show up in the summer season in the North Pacific. That doesn't seem to happen. After a while, they're forgotten. The counterpart of Mozart among the whales would be forgotten. We humans have invented ways of storing good music and repeating it, not just by memory, but by other tools. Our culture, as we get more people, it gets able to remember more stuff. And a lot of this stuff is, of course, ability to change our environment to suit ourselves, which is one reason why the chimps are having trouble with the forests disappearing. Because we're turning forest into agricultural land, which is really well suited for keeping humans well-fed. And of course, the more well-fed humans there are, the more resources there are for humans to come up with other interesting things like metal birds. So this has really changed the world, and now people are talking about the Anthropocene, the fact that we humans are now a major geological force. We're the largest force eroding rock. And since a few years back, we're fixing more nitrogen than the bacteria are doing in the rest of the biosphere. And we only figured that one out with the Haber-Bosch principle last century. Now, this is both good and bad. It has led to a rather drastic shift in what we can do, but it also means that now we created an environment with a lot of very advanced technologies and systems, and we're still somewhat similar to those chimps. We have reactions and biases that are really suited for living a small tribe on the African savanna with limited resources. If there's endless amount of calories around the cafeteria, we tend to overeat and get rather fat and sick from it. If there are really advanced technologies that can be launched with a press of a button, a lot of us can't resist pressing that red button to see what it does, which is, of course, an explanation for an awful lot of emails. And, of course, some of these technological systems that we're really dependent on, we have no clue how they actually work. There is no single human who understands how to build a smartphone, because we have compartmentalized this across a very big society. We are experts on chip design, but they know the overall way of doing it, not how to get silicon crystals. They have a general understanding, but if we actually want to make a silicon crystal, we have to go down to the lab, to the silicon people, who are really dependent on the people giving them the right chemicals that are produced in processes they have no clue about. So we're living in this enormous interdependent system, which sometimes is a bit too fragile for our own liking. Also, it has a lot of really interesting and complicated problems we might want to fix. Questions about inequality and resource distribution, questions about nuclear weapon, problems about how do we organize this information so we get the most relevant information to our decision makers. So that's essentially the current human condition. And in one sense, it's really, really good. We're ecologically super successful as a species, but we're also smart enough to realize that we might not remain successful if we continue on the current trajectory. We better fix the climate before something gets badly broken, or more broken than present. We better figure out some solutions, and many of these problems seem to be tougher than the current human mind can handle. So what if we could do something about that? Could we change the human condition? Again, the human condition is not just this big picture. Poets have been talking about the human condition on a personal level. And the poets, typically being rather depressive people, talk about the anguish of unrequited love, or the horrors of seeing loved ones getting sick and die, and all of the other thousand things that make for great poetry and great literature, but also tend to make us rather sad and thinking, could we do something about it? And we've been wondering for that for probably as long as we've been thinking. The oldest epic that remains, the epic of King Gilgamesh, that is half of it at least about the search of immortality. So King Gilgamesh, after realizing that his best buddy has died because of divine intervention, decides to fix death. So he searches for the herb of immortality. And eventually, after a lot of adventure, he finds it, but a snake steals it. That's also a very typical thing. If we can't get immortal because we don't have a good tool for doing it, we don't know where that herb of immortality is, we tell ourselves a nice story about why we should accept this state. Nobody seems to have asked, are the snakes immortal these days? Which they obviously aren't. But at that point, of course, the storyteller would tell you, no, don't be so literal about this. However, you're supposed to take the lesson that you should accept some of these limitations. However, not everybody are happy with these limitations or think that they're unchanging. So transhumanism is going to come back a bit more towards the end, but I'm going to be talking in a transhumanist frame of mind. So you can say that this is the offspring of traditional humanism. Traditional humanism said, oh, the humans matter. It's good to make the human world better. And we can do that using rational thinking, democracy, and a lot of other things. Now, the transhumanists say, yeah, and we can add technology, we can change ourselves. Our trick as a species has been to change our environment or reshape parts of it into useful tools. Couldn't we use that on ourselves? Like modifying our species, changing how we age, changing whether we're getting sick, maybe making our brains a little bit better. So the transhumanist take on the human condition is that, well, it's been changing. 5 million years, our ancestors were in apes. Now we're hairless apes with clothes. And in 5 million years down the line, unless we go extinct, we should be something very, very different. It's pretty unlikely that that condition is going to be like the current. And we should question parts of our current condition and see, do we actually have to die? What if we could remove some of our impulses? What if we could add new features? And then, of course, the real new thing here is that we have a technology to perhaps actually do it. It's one thing to be like a proper Greek philosopher and talk about what you might hypothetically do in some possible world. Another thing to actually go into the lab and start thinking, what if I actually added those genes and use that Cas-based system that's so much in the news? Could I actually give myself a new sense of color? Or implant a chip to connect me to the internet? Or use my smartphone to connect my mind to make better decisions? Now, transhumanists are generally regarded as extremely optimistic, cheerleaders of evolution or of science. Yay, science! All innovations are good. Except, of course, that some of them are risky, as I said. So the future might both arrive earlier than we expect. Typical, of course, prediction about the future tend to be delayed. We've been waiting for those flying cars for a long time. However, we would be rather annoyed if they actually arrived, because you can imagine people dropping cans of beer out of flying cars and flying them into buildings. So we need to be a bit careful what we wish for. But also, powerful technologies might contain powerful risks. So a lot of transhumanists are actually seriously worried about these risks. So that's one reason why our institute are both looking at human enhancement and threats. But also, this big picture suggests that there are many good states in being a human. Being a human can be great when you're in love, or when it's a beautiful spring day, or when you've proven a really cool mathematical theorem, depending on how nerdy a human you are. But I think everybody should prove a theorem. It's good for your inner soul. But this space of human condition is, of course, part of a much bigger space of possible minds. You can imagine another species that might have some experiences in common with it. Both chimps and us can enjoy bananas. They taste well. But we can't talk philosophy with the chimps. And out here, in the bigger post-human world, where we might be other minds, other structures, if you combine the human mind with a machine, for example, there might be states just as good as falling in love or proving a really great theorem. Indeed, there might be states that are so much better. We can't even imagine how much better, because we don't even have the right modules in our minds to understand that kind of betterness. Just like chimps don't really get what we're missing when they can't understand philosophy. Well, a lot of people also don't understand what we're missing, but that's a bit different. You could, in principle, educate people and get them to realize how awesome and fun philosophy is. That's not going to be doable for a chimp. And you can't teach ethics to cats. Maybe there is something like ethics that humans can't do, but it's actually very, very important. So that's why we need to explore this realm of post-human possibilities. So, well, let's see. What else? Well, we're making a lot of progress. I'm just going to jump past it. Overall, while we're having economic crisis, it's actually a rather local thing. Overall, we have an exponential progress over the past 2,000 years. The amount of wealth in the world is actually increasing quite a lot. That's good. And of course, our computers are getting better, so we can buy an awful lot more of it. This is a typical futurist graph. No talk about the future is complete without hand-waving at Moore's law of computing, telling us how awesome it's going to be. Remember that this is a logarithmic graph, so that's a curve that's kind of getting steeper and steeper. One interesting thing I've been playing around with is, if you actually are a pessimist and assume it's going to end, where is it going to end? So I've been playing around with this. And it turns out that I'm 95% certain that we're going to get computers at least 100,000 times more powerful per dollar or euro as we present got. That's the lower, very weak dotted line. The red one is a few million times. And the upper ones, I have no clue how powerful computers are going to be. And this is just this century, assuming things slow down. Exactly where that leads us is actually very hard to imagine. Similarly, again, this is the cost of doing genetics. It's also coming down exponentially. Now, when computers became cheaper, that meant more people could play around with them. We could use them for more things. We invented more uses, and so on. We're also getting exponentially better at sequencing genomes. Reading the genomes, it's starting to be used now to check that when people sell meat, that the meat comes from the right species, and it's not fake. And we're, of course, using it in healthcare. Right now, it's still rather limited what it can do, although it's somewhat entertaining to check your genome and see what conditions you might have inherited, or whether you're really resistant to something that killed your ancestors. But we're gradually getting better at understanding our own bodies and scanning it. We're also, as that yellow line shows, getting better at making new genes and doing biotechnology. Again, this is slightly risky, but it looks like we're going to get a tremendous amount of the biotechnological power over the next few years. We're actually organizing a conference about synthetic biology in Oxford, simply because we want to get in touch with people creating it, so we get a clue what we're up to. And the interesting thing about these trends is, of course, that if you look at the World Health Organization's definition of health, a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, well, first of all, nobody has ever been healthy in history. And second, if we're actually striving towards this, using this technology, we might actually become rather different. We're getting powerful technologies, we're aiming for health. Even if you just say, this is health, not even enhancement. Since nobody has been that healthy, we might be rather different in the future. So I'm just going to skip over a bit of demographic, but basically our lifespan are actually going up, not because of any high-tech bioengineering, but simple things like antibiotics and refrigerators. So this is a nice graph showing at different points in time how long the people in the longest lived nation are living. And the horizontal lines are predictions where the curve is going to end. As you see, people are really bad at predicting that. So typically we get a few months extra per year just by staying alive. Now, some people think that's a little bit too slow because eventually old age catches up with us, and old age is actually rather horrible. Not because it's bad to be chronologically old, and you do acquire wonderful experience. Unfortunately, you also start to lose energy. You get sick more easily, and a lot of your reactions get slower, your immune system starts breaking down or attacking you. That's no fun. And in the end, it leads to 100,000 people each day dying. Now, if there was a disease going around killing 100,000 people a day, we would be screaming that we need to stop it. Forget malaria, forget AIDS, we need to deal with this. However, aging, we have become so used to it being part of the human community that we don't recognize that this is actually an underlying reason for a lot of common diseases we spend a lot of effort on dealing with. I don't have the time to get into how realistic it is a project to actually try to fix aging. My friend Aubrey de Grey has various interesting papers. He's been arguing for that we should be fixing the damage ongoing in our metabolism. Basically, by being alive, we're causing damage to ourselves. We create free radicals by breathing, and that is messing up our cells. Now, if we can repair that damage faster than it occurs, we should be able to fix these things. He's been called quite a lot of things, some rather nasty. But the fun part is the lower diagrams are from a totally mega mainstream medical publication about what we currently know about aging from last year, and they're basically agreeing with his theory. Of course, we're not mentioning him. But in the lab, at least, it looks like we can genetically modify mice to age a bit more slowly. We have various tricks that can affect the aging pathways. And at the very least, that might be useful to keep us healthy. Even if you only care about avoiding Alzheimer's, attacking some of the pathways that lead to Alzheimer's through aging seems to be a rather useful thing. Now, this leads to an interesting concept that the structure of our life might actually become quite different in the future. So this is a fairly common motif in Swedish vernacular art, the ages of a man. There is, of course, a counterpart of the ages of a woman. And they intersect, of course, when we're married at 30 years of age. And the whole idea is this shows the structure those picture makers had of how a good life is supposed to be. And apparently the height of life is when you're 50 years old and have some minor political office. It's rather sad. The interesting thing about this whole story is that we have been structuring life, but we've been extending life too. So these days, people are actually living much longer than they did in that time when this picture was made. And that means that we have been stretching things out. We invented things like teenagers. They didn't exist before the 1950s. The teenage years were an invented age where you're supposed to do certain things, rebel to a suitable extent and so on. Now, at least in Sweden, we stretch it up to 35 or so. And similarly, retirement. Once upon a time, you retired when you're really old and sick, and now it's probably your time when you start your startup. Probably because you inherited a bit of money because your parents passed away about your time for your retirement. Now, this is kind of playing havoc with our concept of how the structure of life should be. But humans are adaptive. We can probably reinvent this quite a bit. But of course, if we get proper life extension going, we're going to have to reinvent this quite a lot, like dropping retirement. or rather having occasional retirement when we get tired of our job, or maybe just to get somebody else to have a chance to be professor for a while. My main area, however, I'm mostly interested in the brain. Like zombies, neuroscientists always go brains. We really like to improve brains. And the nice news is that there are quite a lot of ways of improving brains. Some of them are boringly practical, like sleep well, get exercise, and drink water without lead in it. If you do that, that's already going to help you quite a bit. We also have methods like education, which are really awesome. Basic education gives you 2.7 IQ point per year up to some point, and then it levels off. It's really expensive, it's really annoying for the kids and teachers, but we regard it so worthwhile that we actually force them to it. Other methods of training are a bit more subtle, like various memory arts. So one lecture given to me by a memory champion, he started by memorizing the order of 2 decks of cards that had been mixed together. And while giving the lecture, he was chanting the cards in order. He only got one wrong. And that was while doing a lecture. The cool thing is, this is a skill any of us in this room could do. It just requires the motivation to learn this memory art and train on it. The problem is, of course, most of us don't have the time or energy or don't feel it worthwhile to memorize decks of cards, except those of us who are thinking of going to Las Vegas, of course. I guess the memory champions are not welcome at Las Vegas, at least at the blackjack table. Similarly, we have meditation techniques, which again can help you not only calm yourself, but you can train yourself to control your attention system. It's just that it takes a lot of hard effort. And hard effort is something we generally want to avoid. We want to find easier ways. I think that is one of the hallmarks of being a technological species. We try to figure out how to do stuff more easily. So that gets over to the more interesting ones on this side, the more controversial biomedical methods. So here is an example about how healthy it is to just use exercise. I always show this slide in my talk about cognitive enhancement. It shows that aerobic exercise does improve reading comprehension and mathematics ability. It's really good. I have my office on top of a gym, and I never set my foot in that gym. Again, the effort thing. It's tiresome. You get sweaty. I want to have an easier way of getting those improvements. And the interesting part here is, of course, that when I work out, well, hypothetically, if I worked out, certain biochemical change would happen in my body. Probably there would be some cellular damage causing free radicals in the muscles, releasing growth factors, which would make the muscles knit themselves together. But that IGF would probably affect my brain. We don't know exactly how it works, and cause extra connections. So we have roughly an idea of this biochemical change. But in that case, why should I be going to the gym if I could just get that IGF into my brain in the right spots? And then I would be able to get those results without having to go downstairs. So that's one of the interesting ideas about cognitive enhancement. And you can do it in other ways, of course, using training. You can actually train the brain directly. So this is probably the closest we have right now to an intelligence enhancement. So this is an N-back task. So you get words or locations they're shown to you by a computer, and occasionally you get prompted. What was that character or that location 5 steps back? And then you're supposed to enter it. And the computer ups the difficulty, so it's always a challenge. That's the important part. A game that's getting easier and easier over time, eventually you're not learning anything from it. But if it always forces you to pay attention, it actually does seem to train you. And it does improve working memory. Now, working memory might be important for intelligence. It turns out that people who play this game do get better performance on one standard intelligence test. We don't know whether that actually makes them any smarter in an objective, real-life sense. But it's rather promising. So that's the closest we've gotten so far. And then, of course, a lot of people are trying to sell this to people worried about Alzheimer's in order to train their brains and stave it off. We don't know whether that works. A lot of that is probably hype. But there's quite a lot of interesting stuff you can do using these computer games. But still, it takes a lot of effort. You need to spend perhaps 15 minutes every morning playing this game. And there are other games that are more exciting visually. Again, sometimes rather shallow beings, but we were monkeys just 5 million years ago. So what interests me is, could you directly do modifications of the brain? And people have certainly been trying that. So the leaves to the left, the ginkgo biloba leaves, they're probably mostly useful if you're older, have bad blood circulation. They probably don't help young people very much. But they have been tried as a cognitive enhancer. To the right, you have some Adderall pills. So that was intended, of course, to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which, of course, all American students regard themselves as suffering from. So hence they are in need of medication, and a large number take it. Not necessarily the majority. There is this image that all students, at least American students, not here, of course, are guzzling down pills, and that's not really true. It's usually a rather small group. It's a few percent. But people are using various medications in order to enhance their mental performance. And it turns out that there is an awful lot of drugs that seems to have a positive effect on cognition. I don't know if you can actually read this at the back, but it's mostly just to show off that there's a long list. And some of them are very well known, like alcohol. It actually works by making you slightly more stupid and disinhibited, which is very useful for us Northwest Europeans because we're scared of talking to people. It's a kind of social enhancer. It might actually help for certain forms of creativity for some people. Other things like amphetamines, of course, obviously stimulating, and they might actually increase the brain plasticity and learning. We just have some slight drawbacks in terms of legality and addictiveness. Another favorite of mine is modafinil, which was intended to treat narcolepsy. In America, you can get it for excessive daytime sleepiness. And of course, falling asleep in a lecture is probably excessive daytime sleepiness, so you might be able to get it for that. Now, most of these substances are either research chemicals or they're intended to treat a disease, and then it turns out that it works well in healthy people too. So there have been quite a lot of debate about whether this is a good thing to have at all. Also, many of them are rather specific. So if you take a stimulant to do an all-nighter and spend all the evening reading up on study materials, well, now you're not going to get much sleep. And during your sleep, you're doing the memory consolidation where you move this material into long-term memory, which is presumably what you wanted that studying to do. Which is a bit of a problem, because if you don't understand this, you might actually be both impairing your health by taking stimulants and then wasting a chance of studying. On the other hand, if you're like my students in Oxford who have to write really long papers for their tutors who really just want a lot of text, then of course just sitting there twiddling away all night might be useful. After all, remembering how you did it, that might not be important next morning. On the other hand, of course, a bit of time management might solve this much better. So figuring out the right enhancer for the right purpose is actually quite an art. And that's, of course, where most students and sometimes most faculty also fail. And of course, this has been really controversial for a long time. So this is a drug bust from Stockholm in the 18th century. And as you can see, the police are storming into this drug den where the little old ladies are drinking the last dregs of coffee and trying to hide the kettle. The reason for this ban was mostly economical, actually. But of course, the king was arguing that coffee was also seriously unhealthy. He was even, according to the story, doing a study where he had two condemned criminals, one that ended up being condemned to drink a cup of coffee under police supervision every morning, and the other one had to drink a cup of tea under police supervision every morning. And this was intended, of course, to show the deleterious effects of that horrible drug coffee on that criminal. And as you can guess who died first. The king. And then, of course, the tea drinker, and then the coffee drinker. I don't think this story is actually true, but it's kind of one of those nice anecdotes. And this has typically happened in our society. Handling new drugs and new uses of drugs, they become tremendously controversial. The first coffee panic was in the Arabian Caliphate in the 12th century, and there was the debate, is coffee more like alcohol, forbidden by the Holy Quran, or anti-alcohol, making some really useful because it makes us think better. The scholars won that one, and they got the Arabic coffee. Now, of course, the debate about cognitive enhancers get also more complicated because there is in Western society this discussion about recreational drugs, and then there are the therapeutic drugs. But enhancers are kind of used in a very different way. if I take a drug in order to write papers, that's very different from finding myself using LSD or just getting high. And since it has this Protestant work ethics tied to it, it becomes very tricky to handle. It's its own category. Of course, in practice, there is a lot of weird overlap, and people who might like recreational drug might be okay with taking an enhancer too, except that maybe they don't want to be squares and writing a lot of papers or so. Okay, yeah, I don't have time to get into it, but you might do other weird things with neuropharmacology. A colleague of mine found that at least one beta blocker, also used, by the way, by people in classical music to reduce stage fright, also seemed to reduce racist responses, which is interesting. It's not acting on the beliefs of people, just their emotional reactions. And this is, of course, tricky. Do I want to be cured from my racist reactions? Maybe I'm intellectually completely against racism, but my heart, so to say, is racist. Maybe I should be taking this drug. Maybe I ought to take the drug. Others will say, wait a minute, that's kind of inauthentic. You should be feeling what you feel, even if it's racism. That seems also problematic. So here we get interesting choices from these ones. We can actually modulate how we work, but that means that our culture, our intellectual beliefs about who we ought to be are going to affect who we are. Okay, I'm going to run through a few other ways of messing with brains. This is transcranial magnetic stimulation, which means that you twiddle a magnetic field that induces electrical current in the surface of the brain. You can also do it by putting electrodes and sending a single current across. If you do this at the right spot, you can increase or decrease excitability of nerve cells. Exactly why this works is a bit unclear, but it does work. And if you know where to do it, you can actually help learning by stimulating the temporal lobe, or you can help retrieval by stimulating the frontal lobe, or you can become better at detecting typos by slightly impairing the frontal lobe, so you don't think too much about the meaning of a text. You're just looking at the words and the spelling. It actually turns out that several parts of the brain seem to be messing with each other, interfering with each other's functions. So if you can tune one out by doing something particular, that can be really useful. If you remember, of course, to put the electrodes on the right spot and have the right polarity. And I know some people who literally made themselves thinking caps and trying to become smarter this way. The problem is, of course, smarter is a kind of whole systems thing, but what we know from science is mostly for particular skills. We can, of course, use genetic engineering, at least in mice. This is the Doogie mouse, which was the first one that got enhanced memory. It's overexpressing a protein used for reorganizing the synapses in the brain. And since then, we have a pretty long list of enhancements that improve memory. In this particular case, it's kind of interesting from an ethics standpoint because the mouse is also more sensitive to pain. It feels aches a little bit more strongly than normal mice. So it makes a good thought experiment. Would you be willing to take some enhancer that gave you better memory at the price of having a little bit more pain in your life? My answer is, of course, aspirin. But it is interesting. Many of these enhancers are going to contain trade-offs, and we might want to know what we're trading for what. We can make supermice fairly well, actually. Using genetic engineering, we can not only make them fluorescent, we can make their brains have a lot of different colors for different nerve cells, which is really awesome from a neuroscience standpoint. We have ways of actually giving them kind of marathon running properties, so we can run much further distances. We can make them live longer. So transhumanism might still be up in there, but transrodentism seems very doable. I guess it's just that we don't see a reason to help them yet. And the cats would be most upset. However, the monkeys have gotten an interesting enhancement this way. So this is gene therapy done in adult monkeys. And in this species of monkey, they're colorblind, at least for they're red-green colorblind. So they got an extra photoreceptor expressed in their eye. And it turns out that now we can run these colorblindness tests and they can actually see a new color. The really awesome thing about this is that this is something that involves a new color in an adult. We don't know how it feels to experience a new color because no human has actually experienced that. But this shows that in principle we could use the same method and get a new photoreceptor and actually see a color that didn't exist before. There are a few rare women who are tetrachromats. They can see different shades and nuances. Some of them actually complain that a lot of art actually doesn't make sense because they notice that the artists have been fudging using two slightly different green nuances because the artist didn't see a difference. So there might be some interesting problems about seeing the world with too much accuracy. Of course, we might also connect ourselves to machines directly and use them to process things. So in the upper corner here, we see a monkey in Miguel Nicoleli's lab that has electrodes in his motor cortex that allows it to control the robotic arm it's clinging on. And in the lower corner, we see a fairly old experiment where a blind man is getting signals straight into the visual cortex. He can't see very well. It's a bit like seeing a few stars on a starry night, according to his description. But he can wear away from furniture. He can get around in a room without hitting something, which is kind of awesome given that he's not using his eyes. And people are working on improved versions of this. Most of them trying to do it inside the eye rather than drilling holes in the skull because that's kind of risky and most people don't like brain surgery for good reasons. Eye surgery is much better by comparison. But there are interesting experiments actually giving a sight back. This has worked fairly well for hearing. Cochlea implants are now a fairly standard technology. There is a brilliant book by Michael Korost, Rebuilt, How Becoming Part Machine Made Me More Human, about his experiences with first becoming completely deaf and then regaining hearing using implants. It's not a story about a Luddite seeing the light and embracing technology or a techno-utopian realizing the limits of technology. It's a very nuanced story about finding the weirdness of living in a mediated world. The really most impressive implant right now is Ted Berger's hippocampal implant. So this is intended to eventually help Alzheimer patients. It's essentially taking over part of the memory system. And it turns out that he can demonstrate that he can not only help mice that have had their memory system deliberately broken, he can even give them fake memories. They never experienced it, but they still have a memory that they should go right in the labyrinth. The fact that this even works is awesome. I didn't believe it when I first heard about the project. I just felt, oh, clever way of getting funding. But that's about it. No, they actually went off and did it, and now we're moving slowly towards human trials. I doubt it's the solution to Alzheimer's, but we're actually getting surprisingly good at neural interfaces. It's just that it's a fair distance before we get anywhere. We can also use genetic engineering and then send light instead of sending electricity, which is probably a kinder, gentler way of doing it. Okay, I'm going to jump past the fact that also we can enhance, of course, ourselves by just asking each other things, using other minds. Because, again, we have a lot of technology now that allow us to mediate each other. And that's probably, in terms of intelligence enhancement, way ahead of anything we can do with individual brains. So we're developing a kind of science, actually, of crowdsourcing. It turns out that individual scientists are biased, incompetent people who make a lot of mistakes, put them together into a scientific peer review system, and in the long run, eventually, they do produce very good results. You need to set up incentives so people correct errors. You need to make sure that errors that are corrected, everybody knows that they got corrected and so on. But it actually takes individuals and creates something much more powerful. Wikipedia is another awesome demonstration that string together people and software in the right way, and you get something much smarter than individuals. Indeed, one can do experiments that demonstrate that you can get various forms of mild superintelligence here. For example, Garry Kasparov had a very tough chess game against the world. So people were just voting online, and he actually found that a very challenging game. I don't have the time to get into this, but we're just starting to figure out the science of actually crowdsourcing effectively. We only had this technology for less than 10 years. That is a very short period of time to actually figure out. I think we're going to see ways of doing collective intelligence amplification that's going to be very dramatic. And of course, once we get a really cool user interface, we're not going to notice them very much because we're just part of everyday life. Technology is that which is new, that didn't exist when you were a child. If it arrives when you're a child, that's of course part of just the everyday world. So here to the right, you see me back in the 90s when I built my first wearable computer. And I was dreaming that, oh, by 1999, of course, you're going to be able to buy wearable computers in stores. It didn't happen. They got eaten by the cell phones. that actually do much more than my computer ever could. Now, of course, Google is starting to market the glass. We'll see how it works out. There's some interesting social problems with how to apply that. But I've seen people using it as an intelligence amplifier. It's kind of awesome when they can quote back at you what you said, and look up things very seamlessly on Wikipedia. They seem very smart, but they're also acting as a kind of interface to the whole of internet. So maybe they will be a bit cat-obsessed. By the way, that's saying that there is always an app for everything. That's kind of true here. So here I'm sitting playing around with his cell phone, and he's got an app controlling his prosthetic hand. So he's telling me what to press, and I'm controlling his hand. Because finally, what's happening right now is that we're entering an era where cyborgs are getting more and more cool. So Pistorius is interesting because a sports shoe manufacturer using somebody without legs in an advert is pretty crazy. And normally we cringe when we see somebody who's lacking a part of the body. There is a kind of very visceral built-in response that that's bad. However, Paralympians are becoming increasingly cool. The fact that he got these blades, you can't really see them, but you know how they look, that actually has made him cool enough that it makes sense to pay him a lot of money to make adverts. Of course, now his personal life is kind of making them regret a little bit that they hired him, but that's just with normal Olympians too. The fact that our culture actually uses Paralympians and look up to them is really telling. We're actually starting to find cyborg cool. It's not just a peg leg or a prosthetic that is a sign that somebody's sick. Neil Harbison, a British artist, he's got this little visual device. He's colorblind, but it translates color into sound, which explains a bit of his clothing. It sounds very pleasant, I assume. Now, the interesting thing is he's arguing that that device is part of him. It can't be separated, so he actually managed legally to get it into his passport photo because it's part of him. Just as much as you could argue that prosthetics become part of the people using them. And I think this is true. Eventually you learn to interpret those signals. I'm going to skip over this artist Stellarchus, who's doing all sorts of very wonderful and weird things with his own body, including a third arm. Or the Lizard Man, who's of course mostly out doing this to outrage the mundanes. But some of the body modification people do it because they think it's something spiritual about changing the body. However, my friend Todd Huffman, he's interesting because he implanted a magnet in order to sense magnetic fields. And the point here is, what's the use of sensing magnetic fields? And there are very few practical uses of it. However, he got access to a new experiential world. So you can imagine Neil Harbison. He didn't have access to the world of color, but now he can hear it, and he's making colorful artworks and commenting on his environment. He might have a strange perspective, but he's got a perspective on a part of a universe that he didn't have access to. Todd gets access to the magnetic realm. He can notice the motion of electric motors nearby. When he touched a frying pan on an induction stove, he noticed, oh, it's vibrating magnetically, but not mechanically. He could distinguish them. It's, from a philosophical standpoint, really interesting to figure out whether he's got different qualia here for magnetic and mechanical vibrations. So when I've been discussing with him a bit about how do you judge the danger of his implant? Because obviously there is a bit of risk of putting a magnet into your finger. You might get infections, who knows if it gets squeezed. For in heaven's sake, don't get close to a brain scanner because they're really magnetic. And he's been arguing that, well, this has enriched his life. Not to a super profound level, but maybe he haven't found the right magnetic field yet. Just like there might be beautiful colors, there might be beautiful magnetic fields around it that we never experience. And this goes, of course, for a lot of those spring flowers out there. A lot of the white spring flowers have patterns in ultraviolet. We can't see them. But we're a bit of genetic engineering away from actually being able to see it. Maybe it's not worth getting a genetic engineering for most of us in order to see spring flowers, but some of us might want to try it. So I'm going to try to wrap up things here, and of course I've been mentioning a lot of these issues, and we've been trying to enhance ourselves in various directions. And a lot of the problems is, of course, what do we actually want? And one of the biggest problems is that many of the enhancements I've been talking about, we don't have general data about how they help real life. We know how well cognition-enhancing drug works in the lab on a lab task, but not whether it will help you study or make safer decisions in government. It would be really good probably for human society if we became smarter. But that has an enormous effect, but it's tricky. Linking minds together seems to have an enormous effect. That might be easier. And generally, anything that boosts our human capital, our skills, our ability to work, is an enormous thing. So I'm going to try to wrap up with some of the limits. There are some practical problems about brains. As you probably noticed, you can't speed up brains arbitrarily. Our nerves can only conduct signals about 100 meters per second. If you want to go faster than that, you need to replace one with something completely different. So there are various physical limits on how much we can enhance ourselves. There are informational limits, like I can connect myself to the biggest supercomputer in the world, but if it's hard for it to transmit information into my head, I'm not going to get much of a use of it. In fact, our senses are pretty good at taking in about a gigabit of information per second, and we have natural affordances. We don't even notice when we're really good at using certain tools and that we're using them. I didn't know, for example, that Wikipedia was part of my memory before I went to Beijing and it was censored. Suddenly I noticed that my left hand was looking up stuff on Wikipedia for me all the time, and I wasn't even conscious about it. It was part of my extended mind, and thanks to the Chinese government, I became aware of it. Similarly, there are interesting questions about what are the identity limits. If I change myself too much, I'm not going to be me, so I'm not going to benefit by doing that change. Now, if you're really utilitarian or consequential, you might say, actually, I'm happy to be replaced by somebody better than me. But most of us have some irrational attachment to this one, ourselves. But most of the enhancements I've been talking about are unlikely to really change your identity. There are more radical ones, especially if you start really changing how your brain actually works. They might be problematic. Very interesting questions if you could upload your brain into a computer, which again, I don't have the time to get into, but I've been researching this a bit. I think the ethical limits are, of course, obvious, and, well, I don't have the time to get through all of them, but at least a lot of them get brought up again and again. The most interesting thing is people tend to bring them up when we talk about pills and genetic engineering, but not that often when talking about computer games and schooling, because we have a bit of different standards. Wikipedia, well, that's not as eerie as taking Ritalin. But again, you might discuss questions both about safety. What are the side effects of using Wikipedia too much? Indeed, if you're really dependent, you might become stupider when you're off the net. Very interesting question about cheating. We have obviously been seeing that when people just copying stuff from Wikipedia. But this has a lot to do with what are the rules for the particular game we're playing. Whether the game is being a student, being a professor, being an athlete, or solving mathematical problems. Sometimes we care about how we come about certain things. Sometimes we want to build character. That's one of the reasons to go to the gym, to overcome your own laziness. So that gives you an extra benefit besides the muscles and maybe some of the brain power that I wouldn't get just from taking a pill. I would still be the lazy person I am. Some of these questions are, of course, also very strongly tied to how free are we to actually select some of these tools. Some of the weirder ones, like the lizard man, obviously, it's no coercion into getting it. Rather, it's rather tough to get it. It's illegal in many places to split your tongue. Not because it's dangerous, but because it creeps people out. But on the other hand, my boss might really want me to take more stimulants if I could work harder and write better papers. And, well, we might argue that I have a morphological freedom here. I should control my own body, and that means saying no to changes if I don't want them. The problem is, of course, some situations we might have a moral obligation anyway. You can imagine truck drivers. A sleepy truck driver is really dangerous. It would be a good thing if he could get enough sleep, but in practice, sleep schedules are tough to maintain. So we would say, well, take a cup of coffee in that case. That's an enhancer. If he's taking modafinil, he might actually drive even better. Similarly, doctors, there have been some tests in England about the surgeons, and they also seem to perform better. Just to quickly conclude, it seems like the more fundamental something is to our sense of self, the less willing people are to enhance it. So it might be a while before we actually want to get kindness enhancers, but maybe we ought to. But in the meantime, we might try to make ourselves a little bit smarter so we can function better as a species. And well, just generally to conclude here, the problem might be that we have so many different possibilities that it's hard to choose. One of the best questions I've gotten over the past few days here is actually, don't we need to be enhanced in order to choose well what we want to enhance? And I think it's true. It's a bit like education. You don't know what course to take until you actually know a lot. But I think we can start with something that's kind of somewhat good. We're not completely stupid. We have some inkling what makes lives go better. And then we can use that to try out better things in order to make mankind grow from that little acorn into a gigantic, wonderful oak. Thank you.
Very much indeed, Dr. Sandberg, for this lecture.
Do you want to keep me up here, or should I probably hide there?
I think you can, because this way you can eye each other, you know, with. I'm completely convinced that you're enhanced in various respects. I think you gave in 1 hour 20 different lectures, and most of you might feel as exhausted as I am. This is a superhuman or post-human activity, I think. We'll have far less time for the opposition, which is Dr. Laurens Landeweert, who is assistant professor here at Nijmegen and also at the TU Delft. He's professor in the philosophy and science studies at this faculty where we are hosted tonight. Philosopher, interested in the interaction between culture and science. He wrote, importantly enough, his dissertation on eugenics. It was called Reconstructing the Self, which I think is highly relevant here. Personal identity, human enhancement, and in fact has been working in the past on an enhanced project. So we are very curious to hear what you have to say in response.
Thank you. Am I understandable? I think so. Huh? Yes. I hope I'll be able to read all the notes that I jumbled down as quick as possible. I'd like to start with the last picture you show here, because it introduces more or less the main issue that I perceive of within the whole debate about enhancement, which is what's left of the person if he takes off his hair and his mouth. Who is he? In a certain sense, it's a realistic depiction of a Mr. Potato Head. But, well, if you take away all the properties of man, or if you make them all, let's say, prone to change or prone to technological intervention, then indeed the question is it still man whom we are adjusting? Now, somewhere in at the early part of your lecture, you mentioned the problem of survival. So in a sense, there are several groups of people within the transhumanist movement who think that enhancement or self-transformation is our only key to survive. Now, there are indeed in this time and age a lot of urgent issues, climate change, for example, and these are often caused by man, so indeed there is a necessity to address these. Now, my question to an extent is, can we address those through human enhancement, or is human enhancement a type of, let's say, hidden suicide, a hidden end to the type of person we are, the type of identity we have, the type of man we are? Well, in a sense, this necessitates a little bit more of an in-depth account of what the self is, I think. You mentioned the term a few times, but there is something about the self that makes it into a complex thing, which is the fact that as people, we have the ability to relate to ourselves from within ourselves. In a sense, we not only construe our environment, but we also construe ourselves in that sense. We can already adjust ourselves by choosing for a certain education, for example, or learning a new language. Well, Karl Marx, in a sense, said that that through technology we transform the world around us, but this also transforms us. And so technology or technicity has an effect upon who we are as well. In a simple metaphor, Galilei designed wings for himself, and I don't think he ever flew them, but this was already one of the first types of self-extension that could be called an enhancement. Now, my main issue and my main concern in the debates about human enhancement are that they might render us overly dependent on technology. I suppose most of you know the series Little Britain. There's one sketch in which a woman in a travel agency sits behind a computer And everybody who enters the room, she answers by stating, computer says no. So, well, if we make ourselves too dependent on technology, computer may say no, and we will by definition, lose the very ability to steer our own lives. So the more we delegate to technology, the less able we are able to steer ourselves. Now, yesterday I was in Brussels attending a meeting on synthetic biology, and I accidentally met a few of the colleagues that were also part of the Enhanced project. Anders was also a colleague within this project, actually, so we've known each other for quite a while and discussed these matters for quite a while as well. And one of the topics that emerged there was that, well, if you look at how we are now gradually more able to use certain, let's say, techniques, genetic engineering, to change a bacteria or even to build a new organism, the question emerges, so we can say, well, okay, we are now functionalizing nature through technology, but the question emerges whether it isn't technology that is actually using us, or nature that is using us through technology. And so who is at this stage the lead author of what's happening? Now, there is another issue that I want to go into with respect to that, which is the question, I saw the term pop up a few times in your lecture, which is the term well-being. And my question in a very early stage of the whole debate about enhancement, but it still is, what is this well-being? When can one define something as, well, this is contributing to our well-being or not? And to put some challenging notions on the table here, for example, we see self-sacrifice as a good trait of people, of some people at least, but it doesn't contribute to his well-being if someone sacrifices himself. It defines our very humanity, that we can acknowledge our flaws rather than only striving to overcome them, to only strive for perfectionism. Mortality, our relation to the fact that we are mortal beings, is a very important factor in how we define ourselves, how we define the meaning of our lives as well. And there's another one which I would say is an issue of attitude. If one looks at Buddhism, it is a goal to accept one's fears, to learn to accept one's flaws as well, to learn to acquiesce in it. So rather than striving to become more, better, higher, stronger than we used to be, it may be a much easier way to just learn to live with the fact that we aren't more, better, stronger, faster. So the definition of better is not an easy thing, and the question why we should strive to be better is not an easy thing either. I think these two questions need to be addressed in the proper treatment of the, let's say, moral assessment of enhancement technologies. With regard to this concept of technicity or technology, it is a problem, I think, that the more we use technology as a mediator, the more it makes us dependent of technology as well. So there seems to be a type of ideological claim within the enhancement debate that it is necessary to make ourselves better, but in a sense the fact that it does so through technology-mediated means might render us more and more dependent of those technologies and less free. I'll leave it at this, I think, Christopher. And I would like to invite you as audience to also respond to Anders' lecture or to my, let's say, first critical remarks about them.
I think the idea is that we first start here and then we open it up maybe in 10 minutes. I think you can have the limelight here. I've just been alerted to the fact that I didn't actually tell anyone who I was. Maybe lack of self-identity. My name is Christoph Lüthi and I teach the history of philosophy and science at the two faculties of philosophy and of science here. Some of you know me. Now, I think I'm going to ask a first question to both of you and then see how the discussion goes. Because there's one thing, Laurens, that you just mentioned about the climate change and the big challenges that I also thought was going to be your main theme, because you started with our common ancestor with the chimpanzee, who's getting his or its habitat more and more reduced, and you've got our airplanes and our motorways crossing that habitat. I thought the lecture was going to be the kind of justification for enhancement and maybe even a more radical form of transhumanism, where we say we have to, in order to save this planet and this habitat, ours and theirs, we have to dramatically change because, as you said, we still have the chimpanzee reactions. I mean, we still press the button and we still don't react adequately to the big dangers. However, that was not the thrust of your lecture, because the thrust of your lecture was much more to say, look how many deficiencies we have, and lots of them are deficiencies that we recognize, color blindness or total blindness or you know, the Pistorius, you know. We can not only repair those, but we can only also enrich ourselves. We can have magnetic experience, maybe see more colors, have more values, a more richer life, and maybe extend our lives the way Gilgamesh thought, indefinitely. But if I think of that, I cannot see how we are going to save the planet. These seem to be criteria that are not from an outside evaluation of human misconduct given the limited resources we have, but rather enhancing our chimpanzee desires and make us richer. So my question to both of you would be, if this is correct, which criteria should we choose in enhancing? The compatibilist one to save the world, us and the rest of it, or rather enhancing us in our old desire to become even more perfect? Maybe first you and then you.
Well, the main reason I kind of veered off in this individualist direction was simply bad time management. You might notice that this is a theme with me. That's my deficiency. So if I had an extra hour, I would have been talking about this, because I've been working quite a lot about these ones, where you actually see that these ideas exist, and there is a spectrum going from a totally subjectivist view that, yeah, I want to improve my life. I don't really care about the rest of the biosphere except as something beautiful to look at. Over to a view, no, we're servants of creation. God, or maybe just nature, has put us here, and now it's up to us to save the biosphere and then maybe go out into the universe and actually spread life everywhere in the universe. So there is a big spectrum here. And I think my talk kind of more slipped in onto the more individual level. In my book chapter about this, I was arguing that there are kind of three kinds of transhumans. There is the individualistic one, which is about what about improving me or human lives. Then there is a terrestrial one. What about human civilization? Where ought we to be going? And then there is the cosmist one. Well, do we have some kind of destiny in the universe? And in that case, what should we be doing with it? So I don't think there is necessarily a contradiction. There is a difference in emphasis. For example, when you start worrying about the existential risk, you realize that even if you only care about yourself, you probably don't want the world to be destroyed. But as soon as you start thinking about that, you soon start to wonder also, well, why do I care about my human life if that could be replaced by other good human lives? So then you get over to these deeper value questions. So a lot depends on which value system you plug into transhumanism. In a sense, transhumanism is all about tools we can use to change ourselves. But depending on what values you combine that with, very different things happen. There are some Christian transhumanists, for example, that claim that Christianity is transhumanism. It's just that God is a necessary technology. And then, of course, he wants us to use our normal technologies to also make the world a better place. There are, of course, a load of atheist transhumanists who think this is really strange, but some of them have been trying to build up value systems, but also say we should promote life and evolution. That means we better save the biosphere. It actually contains a lot of the good things we should value in the universe.
But if I may briefly interrupt, I mean, if you say one of the things we want to gain is longevity or even immortality, I cannot think of anything more disastrous for the global sphere than all of us being, immortal.
Well, that's an interesting question. To some extent, this is an empirical and demographic question. It actually is surprising that immortality doesn't do much more for overpopulation than it does. You can actually simulate this. There are a few simulations we've been doing that shows that actually it's the fertility rate that matters. And so immortality, of course, if we go really post-human, we might even reverse things even more. If we could upload ourselves and run on solar power, it's not just that we wouldn't need to eat meat. We would not need to eat plants. We wouldn't need to kill any living organism. And the ecological footprint could, in theory, be really small. In practice, of course, like energy-saving light bulbs, once you have that saving, you might be using much more of it. So it's no guarantee that that's going to keep the biosphere intact.
Interesting concept of we left after we've uploaded ourselves.
Indeed, yeah. Well, first remark I would say is that for you, transhumanism is then something, and it depends upon which value system you plug into it, what the results are, but I think there is already a certain value system present in transhumanism, and this is specifically related to Christopher's question, specifically the fact that technology can be a solution to any problem, and I'm distrustful over that. So if we back the question whether we should use human enhancement technologies for these individual desires or for these, let's say, collective urgencies that we need to address, then I would say, well, I don't know whether transhumanism is actually, whether human enhancement is actually the solution to these problems at all. So if you look at how, for example, climate change has now been occurring and is now being accepted to be caused by humans, then it's not so much something that is in our biological systems which creates a certain urge or need to use a lot of energy, but it's rather the way in which we collectively organize ourselves and how we collectively either take or not take responsibility over our actions. So my question would rather be, shouldn't we, rather than again delegating responsibility to technology or to technological fixes for the problem, be it through human enhancement or through other means of technology, shouldn't we take this responsibility and look in the mirror about how we caused the problem and how we may be able to solve it by taking our collective responsibilities next to individuals?
Would you say the political systems and governments are not technology?
Sorry?
Governments, I would argue they are technology.
It's a broad definition of technology then. No.
But I'm willing to argue that meditation is a kind of technology. It's just that they've got few moving parts.
Yeah, but then you wind up in the difference between technique and technology. So meditation is in a certain way a technique, but a technology is artifact related, I would say.
But governments are, in a sense, artifact related. One of the interesting things is that we can't run a parliamentary democracy without the printing press, because we need to distribute party manifestos, we need to have a literate public, newspapers and so on. You can't run it without a printing press, even if you think it would be a great idea. Our societies are information limited. As we improve our ability to store and transmit, we can run new kinds of government. And some of them are probably much better at solving the global problems than past ones.
But would you say that this is a systems problem rather than just the way in which it is addressed? So you state that it's the type of governmental institutionalizations that we have that is cause of the fact that we haven't resolved it yet, rather than the perversities of human nature, in the sense of that it's easier to go for quick fixes, that it's easier to ignore a problem, or it's easier to only look at the short agenda rather than the long-term one.
We're getting around a lot of problems with human nature by organizing ourselves in better ways. Steven Pinker has been arguing that we have been reducing violence over historical times enormously. And a lot of that seems to be because we have better governments, better police, better ways of catching people who are misbehaving. So technology allows us to change the sphere where we can construct governments, institutions and other things. There's still a systemic thing. We need to understand that, that new kind of government, democracy 2.0, that's the good one. That's the one that can fix the problem. Go for that. But that might actually require us to have certain technologies. I think a lot of the problems we're seeing right now cannot be solved by any conceivable government using current technology. We actually need to invent entirely new forms.
But would you call them transhumanist technology?
I think it's wrong to add transhumanist in front of everything. Better governments.
No.
There's one second question I would like to ask, and then maybe we can open up to the public. I'm always a bit baffled because there are so many schools of transhumanism and posthumanism. I wonder where you are, standing right now, because you've got an incredible electronic trail of blogs and websites, some of which look definitely 1990s. And I didn't hear some of the more extreme utterances. I didn't see them back here. Now, this evening you spoke about the human future in I don't know how many billion years, but in the end, you spoke about the current technologies that are already being used by colleagues and friends of yours, and which might, in the near future be, further developed. This seems to me pretty continuous in the sense that you have people with shortages in memory span, in attention span, sleeping disorder, and so forth, and you somehow fix that. These would be all humanity the way we know it, sexually reproduced, and then maybe enhanced, maybe already somewhat deselected, prenatal, and so forth, but with a kind of a continuation of humanity. Now, there's a whole talk of humanity plus, and you sometimes gesture at it. We upload all our brains, and we become somehow, I don't know, memories of ourselves in the where does the continuity become discontinuity?
That's a good question. So the main reason I didn't bring up all the post-human stuff was partially time limits. And
also, it's not that you don't believe in it anymore.
Time. Well,
that's why you want to be immortal.
Yeah, I want to be able to do arbitrary...
talk about everything.
Yeah, and imagine having an immortal audience who never stops paying attention. But in practice, while the post-human...
Your subtitle was, how far can we go? I think 2 hours is the limit. Anyway,
literally, I do think that I have some numbers that we can perhaps discuss later about exactly how far we can go in the universe. But... from my story has been that the first really transhumanist thing I read was actually Frank J. Tipler's omega point theory. And he was literally talking about life spreading throughout the universe, taking charge of all the matter and energy. And as the universe in the far future collapses, thinking an infinite number of thoughts, storing an infinite number of information. And as you can guess, to a young nerd, that was religion. I wanted to make that happen. And then I realized, we need to build a space program and have intelligent machines. So we need to figure out how to do that. And that led back to practical things. Oh, we need to be smarter enough. We need to have some space program. And over the years, while Tipler has gone off in deep end into religion, and the universe seems to be an open universe, so his idea actually doesn't work practically, I become more interested in trying to bridge this near-term practical things. We're having debates right now about the legality of enhancers. Should you be allowed to take them before an exam or not? Over to the more longer ones. Well, what weird technologies should we allow? And there are some technologies like artificial intelligence that might be very powerful but very risky. We should think careful about them. And then you have this big picture about where we might be going. And different transhumanists have very different pictures. Some are content to turn into something like Greek gods. Imagine all the stuff I've been talking about here in my lecture. If you got that, you would be a bit like immortal. You would probably have nice extensions and would have a great sex life for as long as you wanted. But others, of course, say, no, I want more. I want to actually get beyond Homo sapiens and experience those things that are as beyond our current experience as our experience is probably beyond what the chimp has. Now, very much less we can say about that. We can make this general argument that Nick Bostrom came up with, that very, very likely states out in that space that are really good. But we do get into the identity problem that, well, if I want to become a real post-human, am I retaining enough of my identity for it to actually be relevant for me? I got a rather crazy view of personal identity myself, so I'm kind of okay with rather drastic changes. But some of my colleagues, even transhumanist colleagues, think that no, they have a much more restricted one. So it might even be that we're going to have different branches of people willing to go differently radically far out. I'm not certain, however, that how much that can be reflected in the ethical debate right now, because we're still a while away from it.
Well, that already presumes that the possibility will occur. And the question is, of course, whether technology will indeed be enable us to go that far. This is not certain yet, of course. There's another issue, though, and this is, well, if you consider persons or humans to be nothing more than information, then this idea of mind uploading on an internet or on a computer might be conceivable. But the issue that I also see emerge here is indeed whether this person that was there before, is it still there then? It's not called Homo sapiens 2.0 for nothing. It's a different, at least in its fictional shape now, it's a different species. It's so the idea that we would become blah blah blah, it's no longer that we anymore. So in a sense, transhumanism therefore seems to support a certain type of suicide of human Homo sapiens. Now, I see some ethical issues here.
Well, but you can turn it around, of course, and say, well, maybe that's the meaning. Nietzsche, after all, argued that the overman gives meaning to human existence. We can get meaning in our life by trying to become the ancestors of the overman. And you can, of course, just replace words here and get some similar sounding argument that, well, maybe the meaning of our lives is to try to create a post-humanity that really has some awesome properties, whatever these good properties we ought to be striving for. So there is something interesting here about both why should we extend our own lives and why should we extend the lifespan of our species. A normal mammalian species tend to survive for about 5 to 12 million years. And, well, if humanity just lasted 5 million years, would we be happy with that? Would we say, let's accept finitude? But quite a lot of species, of course, they don't die out. They branch into other species. Would we say it's a failure that we leave a descendant species? That seems rather strange. In fact, we would probably be rather happy if in the future humanity evolved into something else, even if it may be not intelligent.
Well, it depends a bit on what basis we inform ourselves in which direction to take. So, of course, mankind will probably also prove to be a finite species. It's not something that we like to address, but even specifically in the light of the urgent issues you mentioned earlier, this is something that we have to face as a possibility. But then the problem becomes which criteria do we take as a, let's say, limited species with a limited mind? How can we even presume to know which criteria we opt for to design this new phase of humanity, so to speak? Who is going to sit around the table to decide upon, okay, that's the direction that we're going to take, and why should the rest of the humanity accept those as the proper criteria?
I don't think it's possible to actually centralize decisions on the species level. We can't do it yet. Suppose we could develop some method of actually doing it, what Nick Bostrom calls a singleton, a kind of governing principle, whether that's a supercomputer or a council of world elders or whatever. What they say goes. Would we want to have it? It would be great probably for steering us away from certain risks. They could actually force us to be dealing with climate change. But also we have this feeling, what if they go bad? They could be potentially really risky. So again, the choice even to get to that point where we have a central agency is problematic. So then we might start thinking, how would we go about figuring out even that question? My own approach to this is, I'm very much a believer in bottom-up approaches. We don't know yet, so we ought to try to become smarter and try a lot of things and learn from them. So one of the meanings of life I encountered in transhumanist literature was, we have no clue what the meaning of life is. So the interim meaning of life is to make ourselves smart enough to figure it out.
I think with this big dilemma before us, you've been saying we have to figure it out. Let's include a larger part of humanity in this discussion.
Please tell us.
But we do need some light, I think, because otherwise we don't see who is. I see lots of hands up. Now the Soeterbeeck Programme will have to. Aha. Gosh.
This works.
Now, how many microphones are there around?
There's one microphone on here.
Let's start with the gentleman here.
Hi. I have a question for either of you. Would you say transhumanism is inevitable with the rise of technology? It keeps on going. Do we get stupid enough eventually to keep up with technology? Is it not? Must we not, at a given time, become merged with technology just to keep up with super robots who want to wipe us out, stuff like that? And what are the social implications if half of us get transhumanized, and what if the other half, the conservative half, doesn't?
I think it's not given that we must do it, but it's very, very likely. It's a bit like the agricultural revolution. Once some people started farming, they got much more food, they would grow in population, and they would tend to outcompete the hunter-gatherers. Also, since there were more of them, they tended to breed diseases, which meant that when they got in contact with the hunter-gatherers tended to die. So there is a kind of ratchet effect, an irreversibility. Once you invent agriculture, you get this kind of historical effect.
I think earlier even. So, in a sense, I would say that we have already always been merged with technology. If you look at, for example, the development of stone tools in the Paleolithicum, and the development of the brain of man, then these are in complete sync. So, in a sense, we are bred by technology rather than the other way around. In that sense, transhumanism is just a word for, I believe, something that's already been happening.
Yeah, in a sense, transhumanism is just cheering this on, saying that, yeah, this is good, and now hopefully we can get to an even better level. Of course, the dependency part is interesting here. Back in the old days, we were dependent on stone tools because our big brains actually need a lot of nutrients. And now we're dependent on an agricultural system which is more rickety than we would like. We would like to have better energy sources so we could be if oil runs out, we're in trouble. We need to kind of construct better stuff. Unfortunately, when we construct even more elaborate system to solve the previous problems, now we get new problems. And I think this tends to move us onwards. This might be an evolutionary dynamic that might be very hard to avoid. Sorry.
If I may add to this, I mean, I looked at your transhuman page called Anders transhuman page.
Oh yeah, back from the early 90s.
Well, it's still there. So from my point of view, it still belongs to you.
That's where I started.
So his answer in the 90s would have been, in the long run, we will no longer be human anymore, but post-human beings.
Yep.
So that sounds like a prediction. However, you say, well, there are people who don't want to do that, and then you say, from a transhumanistic point of view, this is no problem. If they don't want to go in our direction, they're welcome to remain humans. What we cannot accept is other people putting restrictions on our quest to its transhumanism. And there it sounds more like a program and a choice. I think it's important for us to know that there are these two voices in you, I think.
Oh yeah. And just imagine when we get life extension, how annoying it's going to be. Oh, I believed that 35 years ago, but not 40 years ago. But it's an interesting point. The Amish people, they're trying to refrain from certain technology for religious reasons. And they're living in the most technologically advanced nation on earth. And they're living a fairly safe life because we have the right kind of political deal with the surrounding society that agrees to accept their quirks and vice versa to some extent. And that seems to work out somewhat well. It might be very possible that we could do the same thing. And actually, I think it would be a very healthy thing, because you always need to have a backup when you find that something has not worked.
So some paleo-humans will have to continue existing. I saw lots of hands beforehand. Yes, well, let's go to this gentleman in the front row.
Yes, thank you both for the interesting lecture and the questions. I have an extension to the question just asked. In a lot of the post-humanist literature, post-humanism is always posed as, well, monoanthropic, so to say. So it's one vision of which direction humanity will take. In your lecture, there was one sheet on, or slide on Pistorius and also the artist who is colorblind. They both choose very different types of enhancements, so to say. And you briefly touched upon this earlier on. Do you think post-humanism, Dr. Sandberg, will be one collective whole? Will it diverge? And do you think people should be allowed to choose for themselves which enhancements to choose? And if so, how does that not lead to conflict between different groups of humans? I mean, you just gave us the example of the Amish people living in the United States, but they are still, well, we can relate to them. They're definitely human. But what if some people upload their minds and other people will take a very physical direction and try to be the best possible physical being they are? That's a very opposite direction to take. So I'm very curious as to what your opinion is on this.
So a bit, to some extent, this might of course be like Mac users versus PC users versus Linux users. There is some bad blood there, and some fundamental incompatibilities, but they've also been changing over time. But seriously, I think, yes, it quite often sounds when transhumanists talk like they have a nice shiny railroad track where some streamlined little train is moving towards the future, and we're soon getting past the biotechnology meadows, and then we get to the nanotechnology hills, and then there is the tunnel through the singularity, and then there is some kind of shiny post-human society on the other side. And it's one train, it's one track, but I don't believe this is very realistic, and it's actually a rather dangerous mode of thinking, because then, of course, anybody who's disagreeing with you is on the wrong track. And actually, we don't know enough. I think it is actually a good idea to try a lot of very different things. So having backup humanities and humanity go in different directions is actually all right as long as we can have some cooperative framework so we don't kill each other. And I think that is actually possible. There might be some weird exceptions if some people want to enhance themselves by becoming sociopaths. They might be rather risky to have around. But for example, a society of software people and normal people is actually better than a society with just bio people, because the bio people are vulnerable to pandemics, while the software people are vulnerable to power outages. But they're not vulnerable to pandemics. So they actually complement each other and reduce risk. And they might have different ways of approaching the world. So unfortunately, a lot of transhumanists and posthumanists are rather bad at explaining what they actually believe in. Or they, like me, gradually change what they believe in. So the end result sounds very much like a one-size-fits-all. There is some form of perfection, and you better get on the program and get there, otherwise you failed. But just look at this list of meanings of life. Those people don't agree with each other. There are a lot of interest in very different means. I think we should be trying to pursue most of them.
But isn't being able to relate to each other a necessary condition to be able to do that? So it works for the Amish and the normal Americans. Might work for the Mac users and the PC users. But
maybe.
What if some people don't have bodies anymore and
yeah.
other people do? I mean, it's very difficult to still think of them as belonging to the same category.
Yeah. But I think the same people would probably back in the Renaissance would probably say, but you can't have people with different religions in the same society. That's not possible. Okay. Actually, in the English have been fighting several wars about it, because it's absolutely impossible to mix Protestants and Catholics in England. They believed. Eventually, we realized that this is just bad for business. Let's give up on it. We figured out. We
discovered earlier in the Netherlands.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's why we had the Glorious Revolution, where we kind of forcibly imported a sensible government. But the interesting part is you can construct solutions for it. It might turn out to be really tricky if people are too radically different from each other. That was Francis Fukuyama's great fear in his critique of transhumanism, our post-human future. He felt that, oh, this kind of diversity is going to be bad for liberal democracy. Except, of course, that liberal democracy is really good at handling people with very different styles of thinking and ideologies and levels of power compared to all the other systems we come up with. Most of the class-based systems or authoritarian systems, they really break down when people are too different inside them. We probably just need to develop liberal democracy to a 2.0 version that actually resolves some of the more radical problems. If you have really fast software people, you might need a special rapid parliament for them, and you need to link that to the normal parliament somehow. But
I have a question to pose to you in this light, but I have to start with a short anecdote. You know Diogenes, the philosopher, of course. Huh? At a certain moment, he was on his usual spot, lying on the town square in the sun, and there was this general of Alexander the Great who stumbled upon to the square. He had had a very long trip, and he drank out of the fountain with his hands. Now, Diogenes had decided that he would abstain from any possession. The only thing that he still had was his drinking mug. He saw this happening and said that I didn't think of this before, and he threw his last possession on the floor. Now, my question to you in this light is, your story seems to embrace a scientific positivism, science or technology as, let's say, always something better than a lack of science and technology. But isn't there also something to be said for the idea of lessening our technology-mediated condition humaine?
I think it depends on what it is. For example, do I want to lessen my dependency on modern medical technology? Perhaps, but it would be stupid of me to avoid health checks and so on. But it might make sense for me to work out, again, to get back to that darn gym, because that way I would be actually lessening my dependency. Would it make sense for me to give up computers? I would think, no, I can't do a lot of things that is actually giving my life very much meaning. But there are plenty of other things, indeed, that we can give up. But to some extent, being able to give them up is also possible because we have a safety net in our society. We have a system that, if it turns out to be stupid, I can get things back. I think the really important questions are, of course, what do we give up mentally? Sometimes, like in my outsourcing of memory to Wikipedia, I might be giving up something unconscious, and that's probably a bad idea. Now I'm okay with putting some of my memory into Wikipedia, but I'm aware that I'm making this decision, and I am indeed dependent on Wikipedia. That's also a bit of giving up. I don't necessarily have to keep everything in my head. So I think we're going to see more of this. A lot of the choices we do about our everyday technology are getting more and more subtle. What kind of smartphone do you use? Or do you actually decide not to use a smartphone because it will try to run your life?
A question, does your building have an elevator?
No.
Ah, well, if it would have...
well, actually, my office building has one, but I generally don't use it.
It's a way to avoid the gym.
A little bit, but it's not helping.
But if I may add something to the question that's just been asked, I think we are all incredibly influenced by movies such as Star Wars. We've got robots, human-looking beings, big chimpanzees, machines, somehow interacting and understanding each other. So in your model of a sort of a liberal democracy, they can all somehow live together in the same way in which Macintosh users and Amish people and so on can. I actually doubt that a lot. And one of the reasons is that if you get a group that is cognitively enhanced, which is of course not the difference between the Amish. They have a perfectly good system of education, only that they couldn't end up working on Wall Street for what they know. But they can be left in a kind of a habitat, and they're being protected because they belong to the folklore of the United States. They look like the Pilgrim Fathers. But once you have a society in which there is no kind of folkloristic protection of people who walk around in wooden shoes, klomp or something. In that case, you would have a cognitively enhanced class of people, and people who, for whatever religious or ideological reasons won't do it. It is going to lead inevitably to a kind of apartheid. It cannot be otherwise. I mean, the ones will simply perform so much better that they will outrival the others. University diplomas, jobs, government, everything.
We have it to some degree right now in terms of being informed. Ideally, we want decisions to be made by people who have been educated and are informed. We might respect the sincerity of opinions of people who are not informed and have no education. We might respect them as people, but we don't think their arguments are very good because they don't know the full picture. In a sense, we're having an apartheid against the uninformed. Yet we would say, well, in that case, that distinction actually matters. So in discrimination is bad when it's about something that doesn't matter. We want a society that treats people equally as people. However, we probably don't want a society where everybody can be a surgeon regardless of surgical skill. So if you have cognitively enhanced people and they actually are really smart and can handle some things, then it might be that, yeah, they have responsibilities and duties related to that. Again, there is that famous saying, with great power comes great responsibility. It might be that in a society with cognitively enhanced people, we're also going to put a lot of load on them too. Because they, of course, if they do something stupid, they should have known that beforehand to a much greater degree than normal people. So I think there are going to be interesting tensions here. And in many cases, I think cognitive enhancement is probably a general purpose good that most people would actually want to have. Regardless of what your life project is, almost. Diogenes might disagree because he was actually pretty content with the level of wisdom he had and the amount of sunshine he got in Athens. But for most life projects, being smarter is actually useful. So most people would probably want to choose that.
Diogenes and his father were failed bankers. That's actually an interesting story. Who else in the... Yes, you have a gentleman here. In the blue. Here. Sorry, who else was interested? I just want to have a poll. Yeah, someone? Okay.
Considering that the human experience and the transhumanist experience is very different, would it not be possible... That's the first question. Would it be possible to maybe have both experiences, allowing people to both experience the human life and the transhuman life? And yeah, how can you? Because it's the same as like, for example, if you're a dog, We can never know what is, well, it's the famous paper, what it's like to be a bat. Would it be possible in a transhumanist society to still have the old experience and the new? Maybe even switch out between the two experiences?
Yeah, I think a lot of experiences are definitely possible. After all, we can have a lot of monkey experiences, and that works pretty well. That's partially what alcohol is for, to some extent. But there is a deeper problem, of course, because there might be some experiences that only make sense if you're enhanced. If you, there might be some physics that only makes sense if you really have a super intelligent brain that can solve differential equations effortlessly in your head. So if you go back, remove that ability and go back to human, you only remember maybe the human part of emotions you experienced when you did that physics. That might be very partial. Or maybe that is actually the core part. Because in a sense, of course, our brains have already been built on a set of enhancements on top of it. In a sense, we have a spinal cord with pattern generators just regenerating rhythmical movements. And then you got some simple sensory things in the midbrain that control which pattern generator got turned on and off. In a sense, that was just a support function to make them a little bit more accurate when you should be swimming left or right. Then you got a limbic system on top of that to create a bit of a long-term memory and motivational state. Am I right now trying to escape a predator or mate? And switch back and forth between it appropriately. And then we got the cortex on top of it. So each of these ones are in a sense just doing a subordinate role to the previous ones. In a sense, our giant brains are just in order to make us move and open our mouths at the right spot. However, they kind of hijack the process, and we're finding meanings using our cerebral cortex that our spinal cord has no clue about. Now, the weirder situation with transhumans might be, now we have self-aware spinal cords and self-aware higher levels too. So I think it would be hard to take some of the higher things back into a simpler mode. But there are a lot of these really basic things, the enjoyment of life, being in a sunny spot and just relaxing. That would be true even for the real advanced post-human, except that he might be doing it using differential geometry.
You want to add something to this? No.
No, the only thing that one thing actually. The point about removability is, I think, that which distinguishes transhumanism for any other, let's say, belief in technology and enthusiasm for science and technology. Because in transhumanism, there's an irreversibility about it. So the built-in things, the genetic changes that are presumed to be possible in the future, are considered to be an inevitable change of what we are. You cannot take it off. You do not put it on your nightstand when you go to bed.
Yeah, I think that's also a bit of a problem with many proposed enhancements, because I like the ones that can be removed if they turn out to be flawed. But the problem is, of course, that many enhancements only work when we integrate them with ourselves. That's the only way we can use them in an authentic way. If we could download skills like we do in the Matrix movie, so I could fly a helicopter by just downloading it, that would not be me flying the helicopter. It would be a set of motor skills from somebody. However, if I were to use them and try flying a lot of helicopters, I would develop some Anders-related motor skills that might also relate a little bit to my style of thinking and acting. They would be unique to me and bind together those helicopter flying skills with the rest of me. And I think they can be rather valuable. That's something unique and important. But that also is rather irreversible. Now, if I remove the core helicopter flying skills, I have a part of my mind that don't make any sense anymore. So irreversibility, I think it's unavoidable. It's a bit like the irreversibility of learning things. We change our mind all the time, and sometimes we don't want to learn certain things, but we still do it, and that changes the way we think about the world ever after.
There was a microphone back there. Gentleman with the beard.
Yes, first, thanks for the lecture. I had a question about, let me just explain. Our enhancements are accepted when we try to compensate for disabilities. Let's say we are not as good as we want to be, but the system is like kind of putting something in the system that should be there isn't there. But then, on the other hand, when we are perfectly fine and then we want to enhance a superhuman, and as you said, there can be some side effects. When you trigger a system, then the system is built as it is. It's function as this. If you trigger it, then it can deteriorate in another way. So, do you think you would do this? Like, say you have a super good robotic arm, but you live 10 years less than normal humans. Do you think at what extent would people do that?
That would depend very much on what your life goals are. So I think most of us would say a 10-year shorter life, that's probably not worth any arm. Even how wonderful that arm might be, still 10 years is much more valuable. But there have been interviews with athletes, and people have been asking, so if it was a treatment that kind of really shortened your life but allowed you to win the Olympic gold, would you take it? And some of them say, oh yeah. So some life values might actually be worth it. If you can imagine some treatment that, yeah, it shortens your lifespan by 10 years, but you're guaranteed to solve some really important problem for all of mankind. Again, you might actually think, maybe I have a moral duty to sacrifice myself in order to solve that problem. But this is probably going to be very individual because it depends quite sensitively on what value system you have. I think many utilitarians would say, well, that's probably a good trade, while I think some Kantians would be very divided here. You can't sacrifice yourself according to Kantian ethics too easily, but 10 years shorter life, maybe that's not enough of sacrifice. So in short, the question always depends on how well can we predict the drawbacks. Some of these enhancer pills focus you in one way. So if you take something that focuses you, that's good for writing papers, but really bad for driving. And you shouldn't be driving if you're taking the pill, and you should be aware that you shouldn't be driving. And some of them, of course, might have unknown side effects. That's the real worry. That's typically what scares people the most. Maybe there's some long-term disadvantage. But I think figuring out this advantage and disadvantage and understanding them well enough so we can make good informed choices, that's how we actually make it practical.
So you think we will figure it out?
I think there will be. It's going to be take a while. So right now, for example, so some people are taking enhancer pills, and we don't have a good study of what it actually does to their normal life. And we haven't been able to get research funding or ethics approval to just follow people who are taking enhancers, which is kind of ridiculous, but just because of the way the ethics board we've been talking with, how they interpret it, because they're afraid of us, in some sense, legitimizing something they find morally problematic. However, our goal is, of course, to figure out, does it actually work? Because it's very likely that a lot of enhancer pills people are taking are just wasted and actually just impair health at a certain great cost. But before we know that, we're not going to be able to make a good choice.
I think it's slowly time to wrap up. I would like to end with just one thought. You started your lecture by saying that humanity has been very bad at making predictions, and the history of our predictions shows that. You can see predictions made in 1900 about how the world would be like in 2000. And in a way, of course, your wonderful portable computer of the 1990s, which seemed like the way to go, has been rendered completely obsolete by the machines we all carry around and make us perfectly spyable. Now, you could say all predictions that we are making, and also the predictions we've made tonight, are in a way sort of flying in mid-air, and therefore worthless, but they are not. There is an exceptionally dry and thorough book by a German ethicist called Bernward Gesang, who wrote a book called Die Perfektionierung des Menschen, where he goes through all the types of enhancement and improvement strategies that have been developed or are being developed right now. And his conclusion is actually very, very important. I think that's why we are so happy that you came today. His point is we cannot project what's going to happen in 10 years' time, but the only thing that we know is that the development of all the branches of science that we've mentioned, robotics, artificial intelligence, neuroscience, and so forth, they are going to confront us with ethical choices, political choices, social choices, inevitably. This we know. And so we should also, because the world is so incredibly complex, we should also have the courage every now and then to really sort of jump into mid-air and try to get a glimpse of as big a piece of the future that we can take, obviously with the risk that we get it completely wrong. But we have to have the mental elasticity and the ethical readiness to confront these questions that will and do already confront us. So I think that's the reason why the Soeterbeeck Programme has had quite a number of lectures on philosophy, technology, science, and society, and the Center of Ethics at our university has been also interested in gauging the ethical consequences. I think we couldn't have had anyone better for the long view than you tonight, so I would like to thank you very much on behalf of both institutions.
Thank you.